Live from London, this is Global Business.
Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Juliet Mann.
And I'm Sally Burdett. Our top stories. A show of support, billions of dollars in EU funding for Ukraine announced as world leaders gather in Kyiv to mark the third anniversary of the conflict with Russia.
The United Nations General Assembly prepares to vote on a resolution put forward by Ukraine and a competing one from the US.
Friedrich Merz is set to be Germany's new Chancellor after his Conservative Party's election victory.
And US markets are struggling to recover from Friday's sharp sell-off, which was the worst session of the year for both the S&P 500 and the Dow Jones. The European Union has pledged over $3.6 billion in funding for Ukraine on the third anniversary of the conflict with Russia.
Ursula von der Leyen announced the extra support. She landed in Kyiv alongside leaders from across the bloc, as well as Canada's Justin Trudeau. The group also pledged support for President Volodymyr Zelensky. He hailed the heroism of Ukrainians and set out his demands for any peace deal with Russia.
The war is being waged against Ukraine, and therefore we must be at the negotiating table together with Europe. Russia's strategic target is Europe and the European way of life, so its security and fate cannot be decided without Europe. Ukraine and Europe, together with the United States, must be at the negotiating table in front of Russia. This will ensure the need for peace is not whitewashed by promises of normalisation and a reboot.
Our correspondent Stuart Smith is in Kyiv. Stuart, Zelensky has suggested any Russia deal should start with a full prisoner exchange. Tell us more.
It was one of the ideas he was presenting during this summit as a way to try to restore some degree of trust between Kyiv and Moscow, which will have to be required if there are indeed peace negotiations to make serious progress. He was suggesting that a prisoner exchange, which has happened around 60 times between Ukraine and Russia with the help of mediation from other countries, could happen again, but this time an all-for-all prisoner exchange, all Ukrainians held by Russia for all Russians held by Ukraine and those of other nationalities, in order to start to rebuild some trust that this peace process is something that Moscow is serious about negotiating. As well as that, President Volodymyr Zelensky talked about what he was trying to do to convince President Trump as well that security guarantees are what is required. There cannot simply be an agreement, even one legally backed, between Moscow and the US and perhaps Europe and Ukraine as well. He said that Volodymyr Zelensky, he said, gave a document to Washington's Ukraine envoy Keith Kellogg when he was here in Kyiv last week, which outlined the alleged numerous breaches of ceasefire agreements that Russia had previously broken. He was trying to convince Keith Kellogg to then convince Donald Trump that Ukraine needs serious security guarantees that would include American support as well as European support. He said if the NATO membership really is off the table, then Ukraine will be looking for example, troops in Ukraine, military assistance and other funding that it would need to try and make sure that there are actual security guarantees that would prevent another invasion by Russia into Ukraine. But also Volodymyr Zelensky is warning European leaders any kind of Russian invasion into another part of Europe.
Those European leaders have been offering a real show of support to the Ukrainian president today, haven't they?
They have, and it's unusual in a sense, this format, because as well as Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and Recep Tayyip Erdogan from Turkey, there was also non-EU European leaders such as Iceland, Albania, Norway, Switzerland, and all of them trying to show Volodymyr Zelensky that he has their support, not just in terms of words, but also many of them announcing either new sanctions on Russia and or pledging new forms of military or other economic support. But they made the point that they understand now is the moment to step up and show not just Ukraine that they are serious about helping, but show that show that Europe is helping in order to get the United States to maintain its security agreements with Ukraine, to continue that military support, because Europe's worried that if it doesn't step up, then Donald Trump will ignore European leaders when it comes to peace negotiations, and that's something that UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer and French President Emmanuel Macron are trying to convince Donald Trump of the necessity of later this week. But yeah, indeed, a large show of support, and also from the European Union Commission leader Ursula von der Leyen, who said this earlier.
Putin is trying harder than ever to win the war on the ground. His goal remains Ukraine's capitulation, and we know what could happen next, because it has already happened before. It is not only the destiny of Ukraine that is at stake, it is Europe's destiny that is at stake. So our first priority remains to empower Ukraine's resistance.
Stuart Smith in Kyiv, thank you very much.
Well, let's get the picture from Russia now. Our correspondent Dasha Chernyshova is in Moscow.
As the conflict in Ukraine hits the 3-year mark, Russian officials continue to insist that it cannot be resolved without addressing what they say are the root causes of the conflict. Speaking in Turkey on Monday, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said that there is, quote, more realism in the position of many countries regarding the situation in Ukraine. He also said that the current US policy on Ukraine stands out against the position of European countries. The Kremlin said that the European approach is in contrast with the peace efforts that Russia is now making with the United States, and that it cannot see any possibility of renewing dialogue with Europe at the moment. Lavrov repeated Moscow's long-held stance that any peace deal should include a firm agreement that Ukraine will not join NATO. The Kremlin said a lasting solution is needed for a sustainable peace and reconfirmed its willingness to hold talks and continue the normalization of ties with the United States. Meanwhile, Russian human rights ombudsman Tatiana Moskalkova announced an agreement with Ukraine and the Red Cross on the evacuation of Russia's residents from the Kursk region. Part of the area were seized by the Ukrainian forces last year. The deal will see those displaced to the Sumy region return to Russia through Belarus. Dasha Chernyshova, CGTN, Moscow.
The United Nations General Assembly is preparing to vote on 2 separate resolutions, one on Ukraine's European-backed proposal demanding an immediate withdrawal of Russian forces, and then separately a US call for a swift end to the conflict.
Our correspondent Mitch McCann is in New York and joins us now. Hello, Mitch. Just tell us a little bit more about these votes.
Yeah, hi Sally. It's going to be a very busy day at the United Nations today, with separate votes both in the morning at the UN General Assembly and then this afternoon at the United Nations Security Council. Now, while the General Assembly has started this morning, so far it's been mainly focused on commemorating the war in Ukraine, as well as speeches from Ukraine, Russia and the United States. However, as you mentioned, the Assembly is expected to vote on separate resolutions this morning, one from Ukraine calling for an immediate withdrawal of Russian troops from their country, and a second from the United States, which is calling for an end to the war that doesn't mention Russia's aggression, according to reports. Now, that's really symbolic of the situation that Ukraine finds itself in at the moment, with Donald Trump now in the White House, who has been accused of both blaming Ukraine for the war while seeming to praise Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia. Separately, this afternoon, the Security Council will be briefed by a UN representative on the current situation in Ukraine on this anniversary, and the Council was then expected to vote on a draft resolution on Ukraine authored by the US, which demands a swift end to the war. So lots happening at the United Nations today. Importantly, though, that those dueling, I guess, or those different resolutions this morning at the General Assembly.
Now, French President Emmanuel Macron is also going to be meeting with Donald Trump at the White House to talk about Ukraine. That could be quite an important meeting, I imagine.
Yeah, it's going to be very interesting. President Macron arrived at the White House this morning to meet Donald Trump at a highly critical time for peace and security in Europe, as I've just pointed out. And in doing so, he is the first European leader to meet Donald Trump in Washington during his second term. And the pair have participated this morning in a G7 call with other leaders. And Macron described it as perfect when asked by reporters as he was leaving the White House this morning. The pair are also going to hold bilateral talks today and then a joint press conference later this afternoon, which will be about 7 p.m. Local time in London. Now, later this week, Sir Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister, will meet Mr Trump as well. And between Emmanuel Macron and Prime Minister Starmer, the pair are expected to encourage Donald Trump to A, respect Ukraine's sovereignty and its president, who Donald Trump called a dictator last week, but also to not rush into arranging some sort of ceasefire deal with Russia, especially on Ukraine's behalf. Now, ahead of the meeting and speaking with reporters in recent days, Emmanuel Macron was asked what he would say to Donald Trump. He said, "I will tell him deep down, you cannot be weak in the face of President Putin. It's not you, it's not what you're made of, and it's not in your interests." So interesting talk there from Macron heading into that meeting. How that discussion is going to be received by Donald Trump will be interesting as well, making that press conference this afternoon a very important watch.
All right, thank you so much. That's our correspondent Mitch McCann in New York.
Our correspondent Yola David has spent time reporting from Ukraine. You're here with us now, Yola. So 3 years since this crisis began. How do we even begin to assess how much it's costing?
Enormous costs. Probably the biggest cost is the human cost, not just the people who've died on both sides of this conflict over the last 3 years. The Ukrainians always talk about a 10-year war because they feel that this war started in 2014 with the taking of the Crimean Peninsula, if not by Russian troops, then certainly by people who were supportive and possibly sent there by Russia. The cost of war in terms of armament, in terms of missiles and ammunition and depletion of resources, not just by Ukraine, but Russia and Europe and America as well. And then there's the economy. There's the huge stagnation, the lack of investment, massive destruction, infrastructure inside Ukraine, not least the Kakhovka Dam in 2023. There was a hydroelectric plant there, but it was the release of millions of litres of water and the damage that done, an estimated $2 billion just in that one plant, that one reservoir. And the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant, it's been basically mothballed, 6 nuclear reactors, the largest in Europe. It's not being used and is on the front line in terms of conflict between the Russians and the Ukrainians. So there's huge damage, massive cost, but I think it's the human cost. 10 million people, over 10 million people have been displaced inside and outside Ukraine. That's about a quarter of the population of Ukraine pre-war. The cost then of 46,000, according to Zelensky earlier this month, 46,000 troops have died in Ukraine. It might be higher. The Americans think it's a lot higher than that, and 390,000 people have been injured in the war. But when you talk about the Russians in this war, it might be even higher, a lot higher according to estimates, because neither side really wants to talk about the casualties. They think it's bad for morale, and it's definitely bad for mobilization, and it probably would mean that Zelensky and Putin would lose support if people realized the true figures of how many people have died.
Yola, you spent a lot of time in Ukraine. What do you think it's going to take for us to see a lasting peace deal there?
Well, at the moment, we have those claims by Vladimir Putin that he wants a demilitarized border. He does not want Ukraine to be a member of NATO. They're not really keen in the Kremlin to see the European Union also absorbing Ukraine as a member. They want a demilitarized border along that long Eastern Europe flank. And they want to have a state, whether it's Belarus, whether it's the Baltic states or Ukraine, they want states there that they can control and influence. That's what Vladimir Putin and that's what the Russian state wants. And that actually is foreign policy by Russia for hundreds of years. That's what they want along that border. So that is quite clear, and the Russians would like the sanctions, the international sanctions, to be lifted so the economy kicks in again, especially oil and gas revenue for Russia. For the Ukrainians, well, they want security, and who's going to give them that security? And that's the problem. They can try and possibly sell some of their mineral wealth, reputedly 500 billion worth, if it's recoverable, if it can be extracted safely, some of that minerals is actually under Russian control in the east of Ukraine. So there's a lot of negotiation, I think.
Thank you so much, Yoram Abdavid. Now, Europe must support Ukraine now more than ever. That was the message from the EU's foreign policy chief ahead of a ministers' meeting.
The bloc has agreed to impose more sanctions on Russia. Let's join our correspondent, William Denslow, in Brussels. William, good to see you. So tell us a little bit more. What's come out of this meeting? We're talking chemicals, energy, auto parts?
Well, it was a 16th round of sanctions, and a real focus of this latest tranche was to make sure that existing sanctions are even more effective. That is why the European Union has put in further sanctions on 74 Russian tankers, Russian vessels that make up a part of the so-called shadow fleet. Essentially, the concern from Europe is that this shadow fleet has been getting around existing European sanctions and still able to export oil, therefore generating revenue for Moscow's coffers. So now over 150 of these vessels have been hit with sanctions. That is one element of it. Gaming controllers, another area of these sanctions. The reason for that is that their use with their piloting for drones. So that is one interesting area that has been focused on. Another is wrought aluminium. Currently, the EU brings in around 6% of its aluminium from Russia, so that is one area that builds on existing sanctions we've had in the past on things like aluminium piping and tubing. The message from Kaja Kallas, the EU's top diplomat, is that these sanctions will weaken Russia's war effort. Now, also included in this meeting of foreign ministers was a new defence initiative. In the short term, this will include things like more ammunition that Ukraine says it desperately needs in the ongoing fight. More details of that will be presented and discussed when heads of state convene on March 6th in an emergency summit here in Brussels, where another focus of that discussion will be not just Ukraine's security and defence capabilities, but Europe at large as well.
OK, so that's conversations around Ukraine and sanctions on Russia. But the EU has also suspended a range of sanctions against Syria.
That's absolutely right. While Ukraine dominated much of the focus here in Brussels during this foreign ministers' meeting, there were several other things on the docket. The situation in the Middle East. There was a meeting of the EU-Israel Association Council, the developments in the east of the Democratic Republic of Congo, and potential punitive action for Rwanda was also on the docket. And as you mentioned, Syria and an easing of sanctions featured prominently as well. Now, what was discussed there, the easing of sanctions, particularly when it comes to transportation and energy. Sanctions have been lifted on 4 Syrian banks as well as their major airlines, so significant progress there. EU officials say they will continue to monitor developments on the ground very closely indeed, and say they will continue to assess whether the easing of further sanctions will be in Syria's future down the line.
Well done, so in Brussels. Thank you.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, US markets are struggling to recover from Friday's sharp sell-off. We'll get the latest Monday market news.
Ever wondered what's the difference between a bear and a bull market? Where are the cash cows? And who are the lame ducks? And what exactly are black swans, grey rhinos, and unicorn companies? Make sense of it all with Global Business, only on CGTN.
I think it should be more global cooperation.
I would like to hear more the voice of the developing countries.
Globalization has lifted more than 1 billion people out of poverty.
The great transition has to happen. It's a necessity.
Well, China and the United States are important powers in the world.
What unites us is much more than what divides us. And I believe China is committed to this agenda.
Join me, Juliet Mann, to set the agenda at these times every weekend on CGTN.
Welcome back. Now, US markets are still feeling the pressure after Friday's sharp sell-off. It was the worst session of the year for both the S&P 500 and the Dow Jones. Let's join our correspondent Benji Haya, who comes to us from Washington. Hello, Benji. So how are things looking this Monday?
Well, it's a bit of a mixed bag. I mean, we've seen the stocks, the main indices, the S&P 500, the Nasdaq, the Dow Jones recover very slightly at the opening bell, less than 0.5%. But the first two of those have since fallen back into the red. So it's hardly inspiring much confidence by investors. And it won't allay concerns either, following what was a dramatic drop at the end of last week, which came amid various concerns over the Trump administration's policies, notably tariffs on not just America's rivals but allies as well, partly threatened, but also many of which have already been imposed. Today's statistics, as I say, won't give us the full picture. There are various other developments that could come later in the week which will give investors some steer as to the current conditions of the market. You're looking, for example, number one, on Capitol Hill, where lawmakers are going to be laying out a budget framework, and then traders will likely be paying close attention to the latest inflation statistics that will be due out on Friday. Inflation's still sticking at around the 3% mark, increasing gradually in January of this year. The Trump administration insisting that prices will come down, that this is still a hangover from the previous Biden administration. What is certainly true is that what we saw after Donald Trump's election victory is a real resurgence in the markets, particularly turbo powering the likes of cryptocurrencies. But we have a warning today from JP Morgan CEO Jamie Dimon, who says that investors are ploughing cash, he says, into stocks with inflated prices, and that pumping cash into things like Bitcoin, the stuff of bubbles he calls it, that could ultimately end up with some of them crashing down in the coming weeks, months or years.
That's a bit of a worrying message. Let's talk about Apple now, because they've announced that I think over the next 5 years they plan to create 20,000 new jobs in the USA. Is this to head off any potential impact of tariffs in China?
Seemingly yes, and this is obviously tangible good news for the White House, even if it has come as a repercussion of sort of being pushed in that direction because of the tariff announcements by President Donald Trump. Apple has called it a bet on the future of American innovation, but certainly the context here is important, which is the Trump administration has imposed a 10% tariffs on Chinese goods. It is in China where many Apple products are made, including iPhones, and already the president has taken to Truth Social, his social media platform, to say that it's that tariff announcement which is responsible for Apple's decision. He praises it as an endorsement, quote, a faith in what we are doing. What we're looking at here, not only with the jobs, is a $500 billion investment in the United States. That'll go to a variety of things, including new filming for Apple's TV shows stateside, as well as a huge new factory in Texas, which is being constructed with the help of a Taiwanese company. There is further affirmation here from Apple of two things. One, it's diversifying away from China. We're seeing the fact that it's building its own chips, for example, within the United States, and also the tech world closening its relationship with the Trump world, social media companies and AI, the like.
Very interesting developments. Thank you so much. That, of course, is Benji Haya in Washington.
Eurozone inflation has risen for the fourth straight month, hitting 2.5% in January. It's the region's highest rate since July and comes after December's reading came in at 2.4%. Services were the largest driver of inflation, followed by food, alcohol and tobacco, all getting more expensive. Shares in food delivery giant Just Eat Takeaway are up 54% after a $4 billion takeover was agreed. Dutch technology investor Prosus is buying the Amsterdam-based company, which will be delisted from public markets. Prosus says it's an opportunity to create a European champion for food delivery.
Now, Alibaba plans to invest over $52 billion in its AI and cloud computing infrastructure over the next 3 years. Shares in the Chinese e-commerce giant fell on the news of the big spending plans, offsetting an otherwise strong start to the year, which included better than expected fourth quarter revenue. CEOs and senior officials from 30 leading Chinese companies are visiting Germany. The Chinese delegation expects to enhance cooperation with German automakers. This visit comes amid rising China-US trade tensions after President Trump threatened a 25% tariff on imported vehicles.
China has unveiled this year's #1 central document outlining the priorities for rural development. Ensuring the country's food security and raising the pay of farmers are main highlights. As the first policy document released each year, it's seen as a key indicator of the government's priorities. Xi Weichang is President and Chief Economist at Pinpoint Asset Management.
The new development is about technology breakthrough and how to bring the benefit of this technology progress into the rural area. So I think on both fronts, I think the government is on one side, keeping consistent policy going. On the other side, trying to make something new, make something exciting to happen.
And you really think that these agricultural efficiency moves fit into China's broader modernization strategy?
Yes, it does. Absolutely. I think on the agriculture side, I think agriculture has always been a pretty big part of the economy, but there's also a consensus that the productivity there can be improved. And the AI development, I think there's a lot of things that could happen. I'm very curious what's going to happen on the application side of AI in different areas of the economy. Agriculture is just one area. I think there are other manufacturing, education, many sectors that investors are actually now looking at. So that I think this year the focus for the market is about in which area this AI development can be applied and generate the most benefit.
I mean, you talked about big data and the advances made in robotics, but there really is a role here for homegrown AI tech, like DeepSeek, isn't there? I wonder where you see the particular opportunities.
Absolutely. I think nowadays, DeepSeek is applied to everywhere. Actually, I have, friends all over the country, everybody, installed this app onto their phones and using it daily. I've been using it daily for the past months, and I really found it quite useful. And this widespread application, that all kinds of questions you can ask. I can imagine that farmers could ask use this app to find out what's the best way to boost their productivity, to what kind of business or subsector particular products they need to technology they need to adopt. So it's a very open, really a wide range of possibility for the farmers.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, Germany is looking for a strong leader, but can likely new Chancellor Friedrich Merz deliver?
Events have consequences. Words create impact.
Unprecedented scenes that we saw.
The cleanup operation is now well and truly underway.
Parts of southern Europe remain in a state of emergency.
Context gives meaning. People make history.
Far more than 1,000 people have come here today.
But authorities are still on high alert.
So now we've actually become the border on this road.
A complex world demands a comprehensive view.
But with the cleanup efforts more or less under control,
the economic impact is bound to ripple across the country.
There's plastic pollution everywhere.
Because the world today matters for your world tomorrow.
This is the living area of the crew.
The focus is firmly on future technologies.
Well, this is something completely different.
The world today, every day on CGTN. What do we mean when we talk about the difference? The difference is in the detail, the background,
defense ministers from
the wider angle and perspective of every story, wherever the story may be. CGTN. See the difference.
We are all connected. Across borders, across continents, connected by ideas, a shared humanity. Stay connected.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe with Sally Burdett and me, Juliet Mann. The headlines again. A show of support. Billions of dollars in EU funding for Ukraine announced as world leaders gather in Kyiv to mark the third anniversary of the conflict with Russia.
The United Nations General Assembly prepares to vote on a resolution put forward by Ukraine and a competing one from the United States.
The conflict has had a devastating effect on Ukraine's economy, but the impact goes beyond Ukraine itself. Here's our correspondent, Michael Murillier.
Thanks, Juliet. Both Russians and Ukrainians are paying for this conflict with their blood, but there's also been a massive financial cost. The World Bank said last year that Ukraine would need nearly $490 billion to rebuild infrastructure over the next decade. That's more than double the size of its GDP in 2021, the year before the conflict began. Now, Ukraine has also struggled to grow its economy. It shrunk by nearly 30% in 2022, but has recovered slightly since then. However, it is still much smaller than it was just 3 years ago. Meanwhile, Russia is set to pump $145 billion into its military this year. That's roughly a third of its entire national spending budget. Russia says its economy grew just over 4% last year. That's despite a range of sanctions imposed by the West. But its military spending has pushed up inflation. It was 9.9% in January, the highest level in nearly 2 years. The conflict also played a role in a cost of living crisis that spread across the world. Global inflation surged to nearly 8% in 2022, rather 9%. That's as Russia reduced its gas supplies, pushing up the price of energy. And consumers are still paying a price. Global inflation was on average 5% last year, still higher than it was in early 2022. Meanwhile, central banks have maintained high interest rates in a bid to curb prices. And higher rates have slowed economic growth.
Yeah, and I asked Jeffrey Sachs, a leading international economist and former senior advisor to the United Nations, if he was hopeful the conflict in Ukraine would end soon.
I'm very cautious, but I am hopeful because we've heard some truth, some clarity from leading U.S. officials. There have been meetings between senior Russian and U.S. officials. There will be more meetings this coming week. The phone call between President Trump and President Putin, which broke 3 years of diplomatic non-communication, is a real breakthrough. So I'm cautious, but I am also optimistic.
Friedrich Merz is set to be Germany's next leader after his Conservative Party won the country's national election with 28% of the vote.
Merz's Christian Democratic Union will soon start talks to form a coalition government, likely with the ousted Social Democrats. Natalie Carney has more.
With the highest number of ballots cast since unification in 1990, Germans were eager to exercise their democratic right, and those votes showed that Germans are ready for change. The country's centre-right Christian Democratic Union and their Bavarian partner, the Christian Social Union, came out on top with 28.5%.
This election campaign was really necessary, with big debates on important issues of our country, including the economy, migration, foreign and security policy and internal security. But now we must talk to each other, and the most important thing is to re-establish a viable government in Germany.
Known as the Union, the CDU and CSU intend to be tough on migration and on social welfare programs, with Merz vowing to turn Germany into Europe's leading power again. The far-right Alternative for Deutschland is also determined to change the way things are, and many voters agree, giving them 20.8% of the votes, nearly doubling their seats in the parliament.
We have doubled our result in 3 years since the last federal elections, and that is an incredible success, considering that our party is only 12 years old. No one in Europe has ever managed to establish themselves as a People's Party in such a short time. We are the People's Party. We are stable, the second strongest force in Germany.
Meanwhile, caretaker Chancellor Olaf Scholz and his centre-left Social Democrats saw a sharp drop in support, winning just a little more than 16%. Yet, with the CDU-CSU having not won a majority, the SPD could find themselves still in the government as a junior partner to the Union in another grand coalition. Here in Bavaria, the Christian Social Union, or CSU, run as the CDU's state partner, having brought in over 37% of Bavarian votes, not only helped boost the CDU federally, it also makes the CSU a very influential partner in the composition of the next federal government.
That it is only possible with the SPD. All other options are highly excluded. I believe that such a change of direction can be organised with the SPD.
Having brought in the most votes, it's now up to the Union to negotiate a new coalition government, one that will not face the same roadblocks as the previous one did. Natalie Carney, CGTN, Munich.
Our correspondent Peter Oliver joins us now from Berlin. Hello, Peter. So how long does government have to form a coalition?
Right. Well, as long as they want, essentially, is the easy answer to that one. But we are on borrowed time already. Friedrich Merz says that he has a clear mandate to go ahead and form a government, and he wants to get that done before Easter. He says 8 weeks should be enough to put together a coalition. That is ambitious if you look at how long it's taken previously. It usually takes around 3 months. In 2017, it took 6 months to iron out what was going to happen with the coalition. But they were times of far more stability, both in Germany and in Europe and around the world as well. And Friedrich Merz, quite clear, he doesn't have that luxury. What he will be most likely looking to do is putting together a grand coalition, as it's called, with the Social Democrats. 316 is the magic number of seats you need to be able to have in the Bundestag just behind me to form a government. The CDU look like, the CSU look like they've got 108. If you put the 120 from the SPD together with them, they will have that magic number. The one party they won't go into any coalition talks with 100% is Alternative for Deutschland, the far-right party. That's being ruled out under what's called the Brandmauer, the firewall here, to try and stop them from getting into any type of national or regional government. Also, interestingly enough, the CSU are fundamentally opposed to joining any coalition with the Green Party. So if things don't work out with the Social Democrats, it may get very tricky indeed. The hope is that we will also not see Olaf Scholz take part in those negotiations between the Social Democrats and the Conservative Union. He said he's pulling out of those. It looks like it'll be Boris Pistorius, the defence minister, who will be heading up those talks from the SPD side.
And of course, a challenging time for Germany with its economic problems and broadly for Europe.
Yes, exactly. And what Europe will be looking for, and as well as the world, is to find out just exactly who they've got to speak to here in Berlin sooner rather than later. One thing we have heard when you're talking about Germany's place and role in the world is that one of the first invites that is handed out by Friedrich Merz, should it all go as planned and he become Chancellor, is going to be to Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister, in order to invite him here. That would be interesting, of course, in context of how he views, Friedrich Merz, that is, Germany's commitment to the the International Criminal Court with the warrant that exists for Benjamin Netanyahu. But Merz outlined 3 key points that he wants to hit the ground running with. The first one being foreign and security policy, particularly outlining harnessing Germany's role within Europe and up against the United States. He also wants to sort out the economy, and he wants to sort out migration. Big topics, plenty of work for him to do. He's got to put together a coalition first.
Yeah, and those big topics then await. Thank you so much. That's our correspondent, Peter Oliver in Berlin.
Thomas Koenig is a professor of political science at the University of Mannheim.
Germans, and in particular the young Germans, perceive their situation as a kind of a sinking ship. And in order to prevent from sinking, they are interested in policy change. So they want to have a kind of a change in the direction in the economy, in migration politics, but also they are concerned about security issues.
Now, Merz made big promises in his campaign on fixing the economy. We didn't get much detail, and now we've seen this sharp rightward shift. It isn't going to be easy, is it, for him to form a coalition?
On the one hand, yes, it's really difficult because as we experienced, the campaign really changed. So we had 2 periods. The first was very, let's say, even a little bit boring. There were no activities after the breakdown of the coalition. But then, once Friedrich Merz announced a strong leadership, without making any compromises, the whole campaign changed and emotionalized. And it only almost exclusively focused on migration politics rather than economic issues, which perhaps are the more fundamental problems in Germany these days. So indeed, it's true, there is not so much, let's say, in detail known about his plan, but I guess that, especially with the Social Democrats, it will be, let's say, possible to find common solutions.
Something else which I think was quite unusual for a European election was this big focus on foreign policy. You know, Merz kind of had a reputation as a transatlanticist, but just before the election he said Europe should be able to pay for defence without the US. What's your outlook?
I think these are really the fundamental challenges not only Germany is facing these days, but whole Europe. And that has dramatically also influenced now the current German government, and it will also influence coalition building, I guess. On the one hand, it will perhaps even make it easier to fight together again, because the outside pressure is so high. So there is Russia on the one hand and more or less a failing Ukraine situation. And then on the other hand, we have the Trump administration, which is not very pleased about German politics. Let's call it that. So, but both increase the pressure for the 2 parties to form a coalition in short time, right? I think that it's on the one hand, it's a big challenge. On the other hand, it might even help to find a common government.
Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi has called for a joint international position on protecting human rights around the world. He spoke during a video message to a high-level meeting of the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva.
It is important for us to uphold true multilateralism, to adhere to the principles of impartiality, objectivity, non-selectivity, and non-politicization, to conduct constructive dialogue and cooperation on the basis of equality and mutual respect, to effectively increase the representation and voice of Global South countries, and to build a just, equitable, and inclusive global human rights governance system.
Hamas has restated they're willing to hand over the future governance of Gaza to a Palestinian unity government. The group also condemned Israel's escalating offensive in the West Bank, which has displaced around 40,000 Palestinians.
United Nations Chief Antonio Guterres says he's gravely concerned by rising Israeli settler violence in the area. On Sunday, Israeli tanks entered the West Bank for the first time in more than 2 decades. The military says it's preparing for an extended stay to fight militant groups.
What we are doing in what you call West Bank and we call Judea and Samaria, is defending our security. It's military operations taking place there against terrorists, and no other objectives but this one.
Our correspondent Jonathan Regev is in Tel Aviv. Good to see you, Jonathan. So let's talk about the presence of Israeli tanks in the West Bank. What should we be reading into that?
I think it shows that Israel is willing and wishing for a stronger and longer campaign in the West Bank than it did in the past. It's been nearly 20 years or so since we've seen tanks in that area, and now Israel is signaling that it is preparing for a longer stay. It was also echoed by the comments of Defense Minister Israel Katz yesterday, saying that Israel intends to stay at the Jenin refugee camp and the Nur Shams refugee camp for months and months to come, even a year. And basically the people there are displaced and they cannot come back to the refugee camps for quite some time. And the messages are, the tanks are also sending the same message. The Israeli army is intending to stay there for quite some time. Israel is extremely worried about the rise of militant activity in the West Bank, and these actions by Israel are showing the fact that Israel is intending to counteract that with great force and for quite some time.
So that's the West Bank. Let's talk now about Gaza, where the ceasefire deal seems to be in trouble. But Hamas have doubled down, haven't they, on this willingness to relinquish control for a Palestinian unity government. How are these issues being received in Israel?
They're not well received. If you ask Israelis, especially those from the far right, they will tell you that there's no major difference between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority, Hamas and Fatah, especially those elements, the far right elements from the government, but not only them, even from the Likud party, the party headed by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. The call is for some kind of an international governance over the Gaza Strip. I think there's an understanding that the Trump plan, as much as the Israeli far right would like to see it happening, is not something realistic. No one really sees some 2 million Palestinians simply leaving the Gaza Strip. But in this case, Israel, and especially the far right supporters, they would want to see some kind of an international governance over Gaza, Hamas or Fatah, or some kind of a Palestinian government is something that at least the Israeli far right would not agree to. After October 7th, I think also in the center spectrum of the Israeli politics, there are many people who would oppose that.
Jonathan Regev in Tel Aviv, thank you for bringing us up to date.
The first batch of thousands of food parcels from China has arrived in Gaza. More than 6,000 families whose homes were destroyed in the 16-month-long conflict will be receiving the aid. CGTN's Rami Al-Magari reports.
Behind me is the first batch of the Chinese aid provided by the government of China and the people of China to the Palestinian people here in the Gaza Strip. These aids are very helpful for the Palestinians who have been going through difficult and hard conditions because of the war and the displacement that has been an outcome of that devastating Israeli war on the Gaza Strip for the past 16 months. Now the people here in Gaza City, for example, which is one of the locations where these aids have been stockpiled and have been put for the distribution on the locals who have been going through these hard conditions during the time period of the war. Majority of the people here in the Gaza Strip live out in tents because of the devastation of their homes that have been battered and destroyed by the Israeli war, the Israeli army's machineries throughout the past period of time. 70% of homes in the Gaza Strip in general have been either completely or partially destroyed, constituting about 260,000 housing units across the whole Gaza Strip. These aids are very important and include food items that have been lacking or short in the territory because of the war. And as you might see here on the parcels of food, there is a sign written, or somewhat written here from the government, the people of China, that the people of China promise the Palestinian people a common future along with the Chinese one, a common future for peace and prosperity for the Palestinian people. Rami Al-Mirari, CGTN, Gaza City.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead. Turning climate promises into profit. How the UK's net zero economy is booming.
Today, China makes 2 out of every 3 of the world's electric vehicles.
The arguments about whether the future is electric are basically non-existent anymore.
What seemed like a blink of an eye, things changed.
The Chinese, they have a 30% cost competitive edge in their sourcing compared to ours.
We must defend ourselves against unfair practices.
We do oppose tariffs. We don't think that's the right measure.
Welcome back. Making money from going green has long been seen as a way of ending our addiction to fossil fuels. The Confederation of British Industry says the UK is doing just that, with net zero industries growing 3 times faster than the economy as a whole, and generating more than $100 billion in gross added value last year. That's 10% higher than in 2023. Nearly 1 million people work full-time in British net zero businesses, with the workforce growing more than 10% last year, and those jobs are typically better paid than the UK average. Net zero jobs are notable for their productivity. Each full-time role generates an average of $133,000 in economic value, 38% higher than the average. And it's small businesses that are leading the way. 94% of employers within the net zero economy are small and medium-sized enterprises with fewer than 250 staff per company.
Separate research by Imperial College London shows that the UK is set to overtake Canada and France this year to become the leading low-carbon economy in the G7. Kingsmill Bond is an energy strategist at the think tank Ember and joins us now. Hello. So the UK net zero sector growing 3 times faster than the overall UK economy. Why is it leaping ahead, and who gets to take the credit?
Well, this is a global phenomenon. All over the world, we're seeing people grabbing huge amounts of growth as the solar and wind and EV and heat pump and electrification industries surge in growth everywhere from China to Europe to United States to the global south. And the UK, we're also taking part in that grey race.
Is the current pace of growth in the UK enough to get us to the goal of net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, though?
Well, whether or not it's enough to get us to net zero is some kind of secondary to the huge amount of growth and jobs which are being created. I think it's very hard to look forward 25 years, but the main point is that we need to get on with deploying these technologies and finding the solutions before our global competitors do. And as we do that, then new opportunities will open up, and it makes it possible, makes net zero possible.
What's opening the way? Is it government policy, or is it investors making the push?
The main thing that's opening the way is the very rapid fall in the costs of clean energy technologies, in large part because of the investment made by China and the falling costs of the technologies coming out of China. People are deploying these technologies, the solar panels, the cheap electric vehicles, the cheap wind turbines, the cheap electrification technologies, and they're able to do so at much lower cost than the fossil fuel alternative, and that in turn drives growth.
Yeah, you were saying earlier it's a global phenomenon, but also Imperial College research suggesting the UK is going to soon overtake Canada and France as the leading low-carbon economy in the G7. What is the UK doing differently to give it that edge in competitiveness?
So, well, one thing the UK does have in its advantage is we've got adults in the room running the show. And so the policies of Ed Miliband and this current government to drive solar and wind deployment have been very effective. That's the primary reason why, one of the primary reasons why we've been able to overtake our competition. But we shouldn't sit on our laurels. Don't forget that we're doing a lot of work to decarbonize the electricity system, but we're not yet electrifying the economy. That's stage 2, and I think this is something that the government needs to focus on considerably more, to the second vector of the energy transition, to electrify stuff that's heat and transport and every other aspect of the economy.
All right, thank you so much for your views. That's Kingsmill Bond, an energy strategist at the think tank Ember.
The headlines again. A show of support. Billions of dollars in EU funding for Ukraine announced as world leaders gather in Kyiv to mark the 3rd anniversary of the conflict with Russia.
The United Nations General Assembly votes in favour of a resolution drafted by Ukraine and European allies calling for the immediate withdrawal of Russian forces. It also adopts a conflicting resolution from the United States, but approves all European amendments to it.
Friedrich Merz is set to be Germany's new Chancellor after his Conservative Party's election victory.
And that's it for Global Business Europe. Thanks so much for watching.
There's more on all of our stories at europe.cgtn.com, and do follow CGTN Europe on Facebook and Instagram and TikTok.
Of course, you can go to CGTN Europe's channel on the Telegram app or scan the QR code on the screen to get stories and updates sent direct to your phone.
Coming up next on CGTN, Africa Live. We'll see you again tomorrow. Same time, same place. From all the team here in London, goodbye.